I'm very glad to be joined in this moment by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese, who I will introduce to you more in a moment. And then we will have a conversation followed by some questions from the audience here in this room and online as well. Before I do that, though, I do want to say that when we had initially scheduled this conversation, it was going to be about a slightly different topic. The events of the last several days have made it very urgent to shift this conversation to address current realities taking place in Gaza. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, is an Italian international lawyer and academic, and was appointed in May 2022 as the UN Special Rapporteur, looking at the situation on human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. She's an affiliate scholar at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown, as well as a senior advisor on migration and forced displacement for a think tank, the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. She's widely published on the legal situation in Israel and Palestine, and regularly teaches and lectures on international law and forced displacement. She's worked as a human rights expert for the United Nations, including the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. Francesca, thank you so much for joining us today at this very important time to be talking about international law and human rights. I want to start by just asking you first to maybe say a word about your mandate and the work that you have been doing before this moment, and how perhaps you imagine that work changing now.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Thank you, the Arab Center in Washington, for having me, and thanks to all of you who are here today. So a special rapporteur is an independent expert. So it's part of the United Nations, but with a very specific mandate, like former Secretary General Kofi Annan used to say, you are the eyes and ears of the United Nations on human rights issues. I rather say we are the mouth of the United Nations on human rights issues, because there are certain things that need to be said, and special rapporteurs do that on the basis of factual analysis, legal analysis. So my work consists in documenting international law violations, so violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law that take place in the occupied Palestinian territory. So I do not cover the entire, I do not cover matters that happen in Israel unless they are occupied Palestinian territory related, like the recent tragedy. And I do not cover the plight of the entire Palestinian people who have been historically and continuously displaced in connection with the creation of the State of Israel. I try to make reference to this, of course. So, and my work is, should be based on country visits. Look, so as we are 54 experts, the majority of us have a thematic mandate, for example, on the prevention of torture, right to food, right to water, freedom of expression, etc. There is a small number of country mandates. And all of us are requested to produce reports based on observation, submissions received by state and third parties, but first and foremost, interaction with the victims. And in my case, as it has been for at least 2 of my 7 predecessors, I've not been able to visit the occupied Palestinian territory because Israel does not allow for this to happen. In my view, in violation with its obligation as a member of the United Nations. So what I do in alternative is that since the beginning of my mandate, I've established very strong relations with human rights actors on the ground, both Palestinians and Israeli human rights organizations. And I try to have really wide access to the largest numbers of concerned persons as possible. For example, just to tell you what I've been working on for the past few months, and this is what I was supposed to discuss with you today. I've written a report that I will present next week to the General Assembly on children, how the occupation that Israel has established since 1967 impacts childhood and generation of children, and what does it mean for the best interest of the child, that it's a critical legal obligation in the most ratified human rights convention. So I've interviewed children across the occupied Palestinian territory, having meetings with 10, 15 of them per time in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. And it's very painful to not even know their fate, their whereabouts right now. So I will be presenting a report that contains many of their voices with their name protected, but their age, their locations. I don't even know if these children are still alive. So this is what, my work is about.
Thank you. You have talked about the challenge of access, which I think is profound, particularly in this moment. There are very few journalists on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Many of them have been targeted and killed. This creates a situation where there are fewer and fewer witnesses to what is taking place. I want to ask you about a couple of different concepts. The concepts of responsibility and the concepts of accountability as they relate to all the different actors that are involved right now, not only those who are directly participating in belligerent acts, but also those who are supporting the actors in belligerency. Could you talk to us a little bit, Ben? I know that we could probably have semester-long seminars on this.
Indeed, this is what I was thinking.
But can you, can you give us an outline of these concepts and how you think the most important parts of them apply to what we've seen over the last several days?
Yes, especially in this country, allow me to say, it seems that everything, the tragedy that is unfolding for both the Israeli and the Palestinian people started on the 7th of October. But in fact, this is not the case. And there has been a huge problem of accountability, so responsibility for wrongdoings, for violations of international law, that is widely documented and is widely denounced. And there has been no political follow-up. So the issue is broader. And at a certain point during this discussion, I would like to go there. But because of what's happening, I think it makes sense to start from the 7th of October. I have condemned unequivocally and without qualifications what Hamas has done. Hamas has killed civilians, has taken civilian hostages, and this is against international law. It qualifies at least as war crimes, and this is critical to understand, because especially at this moment, we have to be able to condemn all violations of international law that take place, regardless of who commits them, and regardless of, not regardless, but taking into account all the humanity that is affected. And so I've said there is, as a people oppressed, as a people under an illegal occupation, the Palestinians have a right to resist under international law. Of course, we are not in the decolonization era. We are in the post 9/11 era. So there is even when you were saying that the challenges of access that my mandate has, I experience all sorts of challenges, because even speaking reason, common sense, like saying, yes, a people under oppression has the right to resist. Nonetheless, there are limits, and these limits are stringent, and the rights to life should always be protected. So there is no question that Hamas is responsible for crimes, war crimes, and this goes without saying. At the same time, the response that Israel has given doesn't meet international standard either. And I cannot find one provision of international humanitarian law that has not been violated by the by Israel as the occupying power, and who's acting in the name of self-defense, because even self-defense has limits. And there are two layers here that we need to examine. The first is, what is the objective of the response that Israel has chosen? The response, and it has been articulated in different ways, but it's to eradicate Hamas, to uproot and basically crush Hamas militarily and politically. Let's assume that this is a legitimate aim in international law. And again, for me, it's very opaque. And the opaqueness has implications in terms of what is acceptable and what can be considered a legitimate response in international law. But what we have seen happening is the killing of thousands of civilians, the use of, just in 1 week, and I do not have updated figures, but in 1 week, 6,000 bombs have been launched over a piece of land that is the most crowded on Earth, 360 square kilometers, in which 2.2 million people live, half of whom are children. 3,300 Palestinians have already been killed. Over 1,000 of them are children. And this has happened amidst the bombing of essential civilian infrastructure, hospitals, ambulances, schools, mosques, houses. I think the last update I saw was that 80,000 housing units had been destroyed or severely damaged. What kind of proportional response is it? How does it, again, and then each military action, not the operation in its entirety, but each bombing needs to respond to certain criteria in terms of international law. It is to be proportionate, it is to distinguish between civilians and military, and it is to be respectful of the principle of precaution. So if there is a risk to harm civilians, well, the operation is to be withheld. So you see the layer of double illegality, that it's already evident. But on top of it, there is another element. And again, I want to stress it, particularly in the US, because I've heard people legitimizing the blockade, like if the blockade had started on the 7th of September. No, there has been already a 16-year unlawful blockade, naval, air, and ground blockade over Gaza. It was already a humanitarian crisis before the 7th of October. The population was already on the brink of collapse because for example, just to give you a few indicators, but there is no access to drinking water for the entire Palestinian population in Gaza. 5% of the available water is considered fit for drinking. And in fact, the waterborne disease is very high in Gaza. There is 7 out of 10 people are depend on humanitarian aid. And of course, the blockade had already been called, and there is a wall-to-wall consensus that it's unlawful because it constitutes a collective punishment. On top of it, there have been 5 major wars between Israel and Hamas, as if it was, but however, let's say it's a war between a non-armed group, a non-state actors, an armed group, and the state. So there have been 5 wars, which already before the 7th of October had killed 4,200 Palestinians, including 1,200 children. So this is the situation. It was already a humanitarian catastrophe where someone who's 16-year-old has gone through 5 major wars. And if someone carries a trauma forever, having gone through 1 war, imagine what it is for someone who's an adolescent having gone through 5 major events like this. So, and on top of this situation, Israel has tightened the blockade by not allowing entry of water, food, and electricity. Another layer of illegality, because it might be intentional starvation, so the blockade is a war crime, and if the blockade leads to intentional starvation, it's a crimes against humanity. So it's another level of seriousness. Sorry, I know that it was a long response.
No, that's.
But I really wanted to give the full picture.
Yes, I understand. These are not simple things to break down, and I really appreciate you doing so. I do want to ask you. I mean, I have very many questions I would like to ask you, but I do want to ask you a couple.
Responsibility.
Well, responsibility, yes, but also, you talked about the children in Gaza who are dealing with this repeated trauma of endless cycles of massive bombardment. And we're talking about the importance of international law, which, of course, there's no doubt about this. How, from the perspective of those people, does international law matter? And I know this is a difficult question, because obviously you're committed to calling for upholding international law. But I want to ask you, because there have been, as you said, numerous investigations into war crimes in the Gaza Strip, repeated bombardments that have taken place, endless conditions that amount to violations of international law, not just during these bombardments, but in between on a consistent basis, and not just in Gaza, of course, but across the West Bank as well. How does it matter to them?
Probably I wouldn't have had elements to answer this question before writing this report. But I was very surprised, especially when I met the children in Gaza. I met children of different age groups, but between 12, 13, and 17. And I was shocked, because they speak like little lawyers. So seriously, they articulate their demands in terms of right to water, right to food, right to education. So I personally, I don't tend to celebrate this. I was shocked, because children should enjoy, should talk about cartoons and play, and not feel responsible, aggravated by the responsibility of advocating for themselves. But this also tells us something else, that they have trust in international law. I mean, they were really begging me, because they do think that the world doesn't act because they are not listened to. And they cannot imagine that the world doesn't act. I mean, they cannot imagine a world that doesn't act because it doesn't care. And surely it wouldn't be me telling this. So what I got from them is this request, tell the world. So I made a choice to tell with their own voice, bringing as many testimonies I could. And one important element you brought to the discussion is that the tragedy, that these tragic hours are not limited to Israel and Gaza. There are 60 people who have been killed in the past days in the West Bank. I don't know if these killings also took place in Jerusalem. I personally do not know, but they have taken place at the end of settler violence. And it's in my experience at this point is just semantics, distinguishing the settlers from the soldiers, because they go hand in hand. The soldiers are there to protect the settlers. There are no two separate entities. And so allow me to elaborate now, and then we can return to this on the question of responsibility. So there is first and foremost a responsibility, let's say, on the warring parties. So Hamas, I would say Hamas and Israel, because in the West Bank, there is no warring party, right? So there is a responsibility on Israel to abide by international law. Israel is still an occupying power. I know that many in this country struggle to register this, but the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are occupied under international law. And it's an occupation which operates squarely outside what is permitted by international law. In fact, in my view, and in the view of many international law experts, It's illegal because it has operated as a vehicle to colonize occupied land, which is a clear violation of Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, which is also violated by the transfer of Israeli civilians into occupied territory.
And this is a question that is currently pending before the International Court of Justice.
Indeed. But in Russia, Ukraine, there was no need to have a pronouncement and advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. It was clear that a war of aggression is unlawful, that occupation is a violation of the right of self-determination of a people, and so it's unlawful. And it's to be met, rightly so, with the responses that are afforded under the UN Charter, so political, diplomatic, and economic measures. So the responsibility to respect, but however, even if the occupation is illegal, as long as Israel is the occupying power, it must respect international humanitarian law and human rights obligations toward the occupied population, which in fact, and this is something I've documented in my second report, which is about arbitrary deprivation of liberty, but looks at broader carcerality. We can also talk about that. There is such a pressure on the people under occupation that it seems that in practice they are deprived of their status as protected person under international law, and there is a lawfare. Israel uses international law arguments to claim that it's acting in self-defense. Look, I will not challenge ever Israel's right to protect its citizens, Israel's right to defend itself. But Israel cannot confuse and to act in the name of its security. But Israel confuses its own security with the security of its annexation plan over the occupied Palestinian territory, because this is what's been happening over years. This is not the outcome of the arrival to government of extremist elements. It's been there since many years. And there has been a legal dualism. So the Palestinians are under military law that is written by soldiers, applied by soldiers who consider themselves in a situation of hostility with the occupied population. And then Palestinians are judged on the ground of this in military courts, including children as young as 12. It's a unique situation in the world, because military courts shouldn't be trying civilians, are deemed unfit to try civilians. So this is the situation. Because it's so pronouncedly illegal, there is a responsibility of the international community as well. First and foremost, to take measures against serious violations of international law. And again, what are these measures? Diplomatic, political, and economic. But there is an extra layer. Because here the main right at stake, and this is what I wrote my first report about, is the right of self-determination. The occupation, it's true that it's an occupation that operates outside what is permitted under international law. It's true that it has translated into apartheid by default. You might not like this word, but this is probably not in this sense, but someone who's listening to us might not like this word. But how can you define a reality where there are two legal systems, one military law for the Palestinians and civil law for the settlers, who are also illegal in the occupied Palestinian territory?
In perpetuity.
Forever, because there is no end in sight. And so because there is this occupation, frustrates the very possibility of realizing the right of self-determination that the Palestinians have. This is recognized. It's in international law. It's in international human rights law, but it's to the Palestinians. It's been recognized even before becoming a universal right at the time of the British Mandate. And it's still unrealized. And my question was last year, as I became a special rapporteur, how can it be realized under occupation, which frustrates self-determination in all possible elements? Because look, self-determination means the right to exist as a people and to be free as a people, economically, culturally, politically, over a given territory. And I have demonstrated through my first report that each of these elements, so territorial sovereignty, sovereignty over natural resources, and the capacity of organize themselves as a polity, and also to exist culturally, this is all frustrated. And because of this, and the right of self-determination is accompanied by it's an erga omnes obligation. So it can never be derogated. It's a peremptory norm of international law, but it poses an obligation on everyone, every member of international community to act for the realization of this right. So the international community should intervene to end the occupation and its settler colonial practices and to bring legality back to this tormented land.
So a number of more questions, and then we will eventually turn to questions from our audience, both folks in the room and who are watching online. For those of you who are watching online, you can send in your questions either through the Q&A feature on Zoom or by emailing events@arabcenterdc.org. I want to ask you about some of the things that, in my view, make what we are seeing now very different than what we have seen previously, even though there are, of course, many elements that are consistent over time. I have watched for years the statements of Israeli officials in a response to military operations that they've conducted in the Gaza Strip. Major ones in 2008, 2009, again in 2012, 2014, and 2021, and so on. They have previously consistently at least presented a pretense of concern in many of their statements about civilian life and casualties. But there seems to be a decidedly different tone from Israeli officials this time around. One that is unmistakable and consistent. We've heard statements from the Israeli Prime Minister speaking of vengeance. We've heard the Israeli Defense Minister speak of Palestinians as human beasts in the context of announcing a siege, tightening of the siege, cutting off fuel and water and electricity. And we've heard from many of the officials that are interviewed in the media in response to questions about civilian casualties, a very different response than the normal ones we get. The normal ones we usually hear is, of course, we abide by international law. This is the most moral army in the world. We are very precise in our targeting, et cetera, et cetera. The message now seems to simply be, we are at war, don't ask us about civilian casualties. Paired with the collective punishment that has been announced as a matter of policy. And along with the extraordinarily high rate of killing that is taking place now compared to previous instances of this, are we looking at something completely different in terms of the crimes that are being committed compared to what we have seen before?
Yes, I think that it's more. I agree with you. There is no restraint. There is a heightened level of violence, verbal, that reflects also policies on the ground. I've also heard the statements like, there are no civilians in Gaza. What are you talking about? Like, considering all civilians, including children, including young children, as part of this political endeavor. And this is critical. I mean, we need to dissect in these tragic hours what's happening, because there are a number of authoritative scholars who have come out already saying, warning about the risk of genocide. Genocidal statements have been issued throughout the year, and I took note of them because I was seriously alarmed by, again, this heightened level of verbal violence, the dehumanizing violence, because we have seen it elsewhere. We know where it leads. And there is already a serious dehumanization of Palestinians in Israel. And there is a wonderful author Nurit Peled, who has studied how Palestinians are dehumanized in Israeli textbooks and in Israeli society, because this is, and she argues that this is a critical element that allows this disconnect when an Israeli adolescent, I mean, an Israeli 18-year-old wears the uniform and goes to the West Bank or to the Gaza border, he or she doesn't necessarily see children, doesn't necessarily see human beings, because they're raised thinking that the Palestinians are the enemy, that the Palestinians want to kill them all, exterminate them all. And there is one thing that we cannot take away from the equation. I do think that we also need to recognize that, and this is not something that it's limited to the Israelis, the entire Jewish people have been suffering persecution for centuries. And there is a fear that it's almost built into the DNA. And this doesn't justify anything of what's happening, but we need to take it into account, because those who are not those who do not have their flesh and blood into this situation have to be able to advise on the ground of wisdom and being even-handed, and not to further incentivize or justify this kind of language. So I was saying, a number of authors and scholars have denounced the possibility that this amounts to genocide. What is genocide? Genocide is a particularly serious atrocity crime because it requires a specific intent. Is the intent to destroy in full or in part a population on ethnic, religious, or national grounds. And it's not something that happens with one act only. And there is a series of acts that can happen disjunctively. So they are in a way mutually exclusive. You can have one, but not the others. But some elements that have been already found in what's happening is the mass killing of members of a given group, the causing serious or mental harm, psychological harm to the group, or deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of the people in full or in part. And let's say that the situation of Gaza, 16 years of unlawful blockade with 6 major wars, and probably there were again now probably 7,000 people killed in this span of time. I mean, I think it's really meaningful to look at this from the Genocide Convention perspective, why it's important, because there is not just an obligation to ensure accountability in a way. It's not just about bringing people to justice to an international court once the atrocity crime has been committed. It's also, there is an obligation in the convention on the Genocide Convention, and there is an obligation to act to prevent the commission of such a crime. And this is all the more urgent now.
I want to also ask you about mass displacement.
Oh, yeah.
Some of what we have heard being reported, some of the statements and commands that have been put out by the Israeli military call for Palestinians to leave the northern half of the Gaza Strip, where a gigantic amount of the population lives, perhaps 1.1 million people, to go to the south of the Gaza Strip. At the same time, this is being communicated as a way to keep civilians safe, and yet the Israelis are also bombing the southern half of the Gaza Strip at the same time, including intensively after they announced this command. And we've also heard statements from Israeli officials about turning Gaza into a tent city, and how there is plenty of space in the Sinai for these Palestinians, and so on and so forth. when we're talking about a situation where, these orders for mass displacement are underway, and also there are serious questions about what Gaza will look like when this is over. Will it be a habitable space? What are the dimensions of international law as it relates to these kinds of commands, these kinds of actions? And what are the responsibilities of others to do something about this?
So there are three elements here. First of all, forced displacement. A few days ago, I came out with a very strong statement denouncing the possible ethnic cleansing. It's not a term that I've used before in previous statements, but it was necessary because of the intent and because of the practice. And let me clarify. Everyone in the humanitarian community, from the UN to, can you hear me?
Yes.
have denounced the order given by Israel to evacuate to 1.1 million of people in the 60% of the Gaza Strip, where 1.1 million people live, to evacuate to the south as illegal. You cannot give this order for a number of reasons. First of all, because the south was being bombed, because the south had been bombed and there were no places where these people could find a safe haven, could find a shelter. But also there were elderly, children, where would they go? And the hospitals. And so also there was another layer of challenge there, because the reference was that whomever refused to move would be considered a target, on top of them being already considered a target. But you judge from the numbers. And so I looked at this intent, which was accompanied also by statements that had been given prior to the attack. And during the attack, they can move to the Sinai. There is ample space. No. And look at the practice. And I've said, under the fog of war, Palestinians have already experienced ethnic cleansing in huge numbers, at least 2 times in history. And this refers to 1947-49, because we tend to refer to, not me, but people tend to refer to 1948 as a topical moment which triggered the displacement of, or the beginning of the Palestinian refugee crisis. No, 350,000 Palestinians had already been displaced before May 1948, before the State of Israel was created. And the problem was exactly what it triggered the Arab states' reaction was also the large influx of refugees in their own, Palestinian refugees in their own country. So there have been 750,000 people, at least, displaced between 1947 and 1949, never allowed to return. There are 350,000 Palestinians who were forced out, were displaced, who became refugees for the first time, but many of them were already refugees from 1948, from the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and they were never allowed. This would, if executed, this would be the largest instance of forced displacement of Palestinians in this continuum of forced displacement of ethnic cleansing, because there are also other methods through which ethnic cleansing is happening. This is not a reality that emerges only under the fog of war, because hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been displaced by settler violence, including this year. I've seen entire villages, depopulated in order by Palestinians who are seeking protection, because there is no one to protect them in the West Bank. And also it has been pursued through other means, like home demolitions demolitions of civilian infrastructure like homes and schools and hospitals, and revocation of permits. In Jerusalem, this is very pronounced, but also in other places in the West Bank. So ethnic cleansing is an ongoing reality, and there is no reason to mince with words now. The reality is as brutal as is that requires a bit of courage and denounce what it happens with its own name.
I want to ask you a little bit about Egypt. I want to ask you too, because we are hearing a lot of talk now about the potential of Egypt being asked to take in Palestinians or being pressed to take in Palestinians. And obviously, this is something that the Israelis have indicated they would like to see with their language. I want to ask you about, because obviously the Rafah crossing is on the border with Egypt, but it's not the only way
Yes.
that people can move out of the Gaza
Yeah.
Strip. There is plenty of space in Israel for civilians who are seeking refuge from war.
Yes.
Who is obligated to provide humanitarian corridors for the civilian population in the Gaza Strip under international law? Does such an obligation exist? And does it go beyond Israel and Palestine onto others in the region? Where are the parameters?
Surely, because I've heard a comment by some Israeli officials to the argument you were making, why a humanitarian corridor can only be envisaged in Egypt, why not in Israel? Why not to the West Bank? I mean, this is part of the occupied territory. It's still a contiguous part, I mean, non-contiguous, but still part of the territorial unity that should be the Palestinian state. So technically, this is the best way. Where why should they be displaced in Sinai, where there are no structures, and again there is a risk of them not being allowed to return. Again, if we look at the previous practice, the thing, what I've heard in response is, why has any state at war with another state been asked to host the other state's civilians? This is not the case. Here we have an occupying power which is resisting and is fighting an armed group in the occupied Palestinian territory. So technically, Israel still has responsibilities toward the Palestinians as the protected persons. So yes, a humanitarian corridor could be open in Israel or toward the West Bank.
Thank you. I want to turn to some questions from our audience in a moment. Again, if you want to send them in, for those in the room, there are note cards. You could send your questions in via note cards. And for those watching online, send them in via the Zoom Q&A feature or as an email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So here's a question that comes from our online audience. In your perspective, have the conditions for the responsibility to protect coming from the genocide doctrine been met?
Shall I answer question by question?
Why don't we start with that one, and then we'll go
Yeah.
from there. Some of these I may group them together because there's some overlap in topics.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this question, although I'm personally not a big fan of the right to protect concept because of the way it has been used. Legitimate, I mean, we don't need to go there, but I think that what exists in international law, humanitarian law, first and foremost, is certainly a responsibility to deliver law and order in a way, or assure law and order in a way that is compliant with the existing standards, which I say are proportionality, distinction, and precaution. And if this doesn't happen, there is a responsibility and obligation of member states to intervene. As I said, practically, what does it mean? First of all, there is an urgent need to call for a ceasefire. It has been finally said by the Secretary General of the United Nations, but now it needs to be supported by member states. The killing of civilians need to stop. So this is a very specific requirement. And within it, of course, a humanitarian corridor to provide assistance and immediate relief to the people who have suffered this heavy bombing and trauma and loss of life and are in desperate situations. They need to receive support. You were asking me, how will it be to live in Gaza if the war stopped tomorrow. It would be very hard because it was already an unlivable place before the 7th of October and even more now. So,
And there has not been a ground operation yet.
yeah, yes. And again, I do look, the thing that blows my mind is that instead of a war cabinet, there should be a peace cabinet. Military responses do not work. It had not worked in 2008, in 2012, in 2014, in 2021, in 2022. This is the 6th war in such a limited time. So there is another way that is to be pursued in the interest of both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And this is why I also said I've been insisting on this point from the very beginning of my mandate, because I come from a protection background. There is a need for a protective presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, because having 460 Palestinians killed and 31 Israeli killed already, as I said, prior to the 7th of October, was in itself a call for a protective presence. Doesn't matter that Israel doesn't want. It's not within its realm of decisions to be taken, to be made. We need a responsible and conscientious international community. I do not lose hope, but I do not see any sign of it at the horizon, I'm afraid.
So we have a large number of questions, as you mentioned.
I'll try to be brief.
Yes, no, I will try to also combine some of these that are interrelated. We have questions about the role of civilians in in war zones. And one question relates to how does this concept of proportionality, how is it impacted by the reality that belligerency is taking place in a space that is filled with a population? And what are then the parameters of that? How is that determined? What are the limitations of force, and what does international law say about this? And we also have a question that comes from our online audience. You had talked about the West Bank, and there have been, as last I've heard, about 60 Palestinians that have been killed in the West Bank. The United Nations noted that 2022 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank, and 2023, probably by this point, is deadlier. And much of this is driven both by direct settler violence and the role of the Israeli military in protecting Israeli settlers in occupied territory. How are settlers considered under international law as civilians, as belligerents? Where are these lines drawn?
All right, so civilians are protected person under international law, but they lose their civilian status if they take arms, if they take part in the combat. So but again, this needs to be proven. It cannot be assumed that a civilian is part of it's something that needs to be determined case by case. So, for example, when civilians being part of an armed group might be considered, but again, there is a caveat here. They might be considered taking part in hostilities. But this is not just a regular conflict. This is not Ukraine versus Russia, because this is a country which is occupying another people's country. I mean, there is international consensus that the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, are the territory where the state of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state should be. So there is an occupation, there is an oppression, and oppression generates the resistance. So it's not that taking up arms immediately puts the Palestinians in. This is armed resistance. And in as much as no one would like to see violence, I mean, this is a fact. This is a fact of life and needs to be treated as such. So there is an important element to bring to the discussion, which is the presumption of innocence. and this is not often respected. This year, you were rightly mentioning, last year was the deadliest year since the second Intifada, and this year has already been deadlier than the previous year, and in the West Bank alone, and I've not looked into this myself yet. There is very limited research on to what extent settlers lose their civilian status. But there is one element that's for sure: whenever they engage in criminal activities, they should be arrested, they should be investigated and prosecuted, and this never happens. There is a 99% or between 96 and 99% sentencing rate for Palestinians who are found guilty of crimes, and most of the crimes that I've analyzed do not really, are devoid of offensiveness under international law. And there is 1% of crimes committed against Palestinians that it's even investigated, let alone prosecuted.
And Palestinians are tried in military courts.
Of course.
Where the rules in terms of evidence and right to attorney and all is completely different than in the civilian system.
Yeah, no, there is a complete suspension of basic guarantees of international law in military courts, many Palestinians are detained even without charge or trial. Now, I do not have updated figures, but prior to the 7th of October, there were 1,200 people held in what is called administrative detention, which is an institute that is like a legal provision that is derived from the colonial era and allows people to be detained without charge or trial indefinitely with a detention order that is renewed every 6 months. So eventually many Palestinians confess to have committed a crime because this is the light at the end of the tunnel. So this is a plea bargain. They admit that they did something that often they didn't commit, and they are out of prison in a given number of years. And this happens to children as well. Huh?
And it's oftentimes the easiest course for them to take, because if they don't admit, they may be kept in administrative detention and in prison for years before there is ever a trial. And if there is a trial, they're likely to face conviction anyway.
It's a military tribunal. So an average, a trial of a Palestinian in a military court lasts an average of 3 minutes. So the evidence, the charge, when it's formulated, it's provided in Hebrew, which most Palestinians do not read, without legal defense, because most Palestinians cannot travel to Israel, and 80% of the Palestinians detained by Israel are detained illegally because they are considered deported outside of the Palestinian territory. So they are detained in Israel. So they cannot have the legal assistance of their choice. They cannot be visited by their family members. Now imagine children. There is an average of 700 children detained by Israel. The average for them is that half of the children are detained in a solitary confinement, in a cell, constantly illuminated for an average of 16 days. And this is the period of the interrogation. They are not there because they are being charged of an offense. They are there after being taken in the middle of the night from their houses, often in a violent way, in front of their parents being beaten, with a child being beaten, him or herself, taken in a military jeep to a detention center, kept in a military jeep until 8 a.m. when the detention center or the interrogation center is open, and then starts being interrogated without a lawyer, without a parent, and for days and days and days and days, 16 days on average, meaning that there are kids who are held for double this time. Yeah, and this is the reality. So no fair trial guarantee under military law.
So I want to ask you a question that comes into us from the online audience here. And there's a number of questions along a similar vein here. We've heard, of course, a tremendous amount of dehumanization. There's also a lot of misinformation that is circulating around events that are taking place. and an information environment that is perhaps as chaotic and as unregulated as it's ever been. What is the responsibility on the producers of information, the media, and others in situations where this information or dehumanization can enable crimes? And is there precedent around accountability for something like that?
Rwanda, you had a radio station used to broadcast military commanders calling the population cockroaches and inciting to commit crimes. So now I'm not an expert on these, and there is the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression who will look into this, because we all have received information about, there is an organization called AMLE who has documented I think 40,000 cases of incitement and hate speech. Voila, there is freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which is highly protected. So you can say whatever you want, except if it constitutes incitement, so a discourse that encourages others to commit crimes, or hate speech, something that extremely derogative, insulting, dehumanizing. This cannot be tolerated. So the fact that instances of hate speech and incitement have been circulating is extremely, extremely serious. So I do not think I'm the best person to further elaborate upon that. But what I want to say, because I see that happening both in the US and in Europe, is that there has been an increase of hate rhetoric toward particular groups, and it is massively impacting Arab groups, Arab communities, Palestinian communities, but also Jewish communities who stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. And this is something that I've seen happening throughout my mandate. And now it's more violent, but there is also violence committed against Jewish communities because they are associated with what Israel is doing. This shouldn't happen. There should be a space to give people that really all communities involved in this tragic story, and especially at this particular moment, there should be the possibility to express their solidarity without fear, and I mean understanding what they are going through, because it's critical. It's a critical moment for the Palestinians. It's a critical moment for the Jewish people, and so there should be an acknowledgement that their sorrow must be and has to be expressed without repression. What I see, for example, in Europe, but I understand it's happening in the US as well, and in a number of countries, including my own in Italy, there have been protests who have been, not in Italy, not always, but for example, in the UK, in Austria, in Germany, there has been a ban on the possibility to hold protests in solidarity with the Palestinian people. There have been arrests, racial profiling, I mean, and a serious crush on fundamental rights and freedoms in Europe.
Another sort of type of question that we're receiving is about the fact that, you know, international law requires, for it to be enforced, requires political will. And one of the problems that we've seen is very often that doesn't exist, especially as it relates to violations and war crimes against Palestinians. What recourse do people have to seek accountability when these systems are broken?
No, it's true that I do say that had legality, had international law worked at any point in history, not in 1945, but at least in 1967, since the United Nations, for example, ordered Israeli troops to be withdrawn from the occupied territory, had there been a modicum of respect for international law, we would probably not having this discussion right now. So illegality and impunity, tolerated impunity, have been critical elements of this of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians and the international community, particularly the West, with the Israeli-Palestinian question. Are there, yeah, and for sure, I've always said international law is as strong as the political will to have it enforced. And this is clearly lacking. I wouldn't say just in the case of the Palestinian, though. For me, the Palestinians represent, in a way, a metaphor. They epitomizes what happens to many people in the global South. The tension I see between Israel and the Palestinians is the tension I see between Western countries and the West and the rest. And you can see the discrimination against refugees and migrants. I don't want to bring the discussion elsewhere, but this is really to add an element of reflection that there is a discrimination in the way certain problems are dealt with. What is a war? What is legitimate self-defense, or the duty to protect people in situation of armed conflict. So there are many realities that are forgotten. The Palestinians is not, and you can see that there is a complete disconnect between the political echelon in many countries in the West and the civil society. Once again, the squares and streets have been filled with thousands of people at the moment where everyone is told, no, but the Palestinian question doesn't interest. I mean, I'm often told with this in Europe, yeah, no one is interested in the Palestinian question anymore. This is not true. This is the politicians who have made it a non-priority. And this is the media who's been complicit in this, and not the people. The people have not forgotten. And even with the bans on protests in the UK, in Austria, in Holland, and in Holland, I don't know if there was a ban, but in Germany, they took the streets. And this is again, because they also see not only there is a level of hurt humanity in what the Palestinians have been enduring, but the people are conscious of the fact they're really discriminated against, even at the point where, I mean, they're being massacred and there is no condemnation, no clear, honest, full-hearted condemnation of what they are going through.
Francesca, we're just about out of time, but I do want to give you an opportunity as we close out here to say if you have any particular message at this time to U.S. policymakers, to decision makers who are in this moment perhaps making crucial decisions about what happens next, and with many lives hanging in the balance.
Yeah, my message is that I mean, I really wish this was an opportunity for the international community and policymakers, including the US, who are the most influential foreign actors in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, let's say, on this question, to act with wisdom, as I said, and even-handedly. Because there is no military response, there is no security response, which is going to guarantee really safety and security for all people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's a moment to stand, it's the moment to stand in solidarity with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And calling for an immediate ceasefire is the first step toward what I think should be a negotiated way out, a negotiated solution, forgetting for a second one state, two states, or whatever other forms this political solution might take, but putting at the center of the decisions the rights of everyone, the rights of all, equality of all, dignity and freedom of all, both Israelis and the Palestinians. This is the best and the only way to ensure to both people to live in safety and security and freedom in that land.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We'll leave it at that. Thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. For all those watching us online, you can continue to follow our events and activities at ArabCenterDC.org. Thank you.
Thank you.